Welcome back, everybody. My name's Tommy McCarthy, and this is Let's Talk Cyber. Well, there we have it. No stranger to us at Let's Talk Cyber, our one and only Irene Coyle, Chief Operating Officer at OSP Cyber Academy. Now, I'll be careful what I say here. She's not going to be talking about boring stuff. She's going to be talking about the stuff that we all need to know more about and what we should be doing in our businesses. But before we get into that, Irene, welcome to Let's Talk Cyber. Tell us all a little bit about what you've done in your whole life professionally and where you are right now.
We don't have time for that, Thomas, to go through my whole life. You know how old I am.
Give us a snapshot. Come on.
So in terms of career-wise, I was 30 years in the police in Scotland, in Police Scotland. I retired in 2018 after having a really fantastic career, actually, very varied, worked in a number of different departments, had some great projects, developing a vulnerable persons database or managing the development of a vulnerable persons database, investigations, professional standards, vulnerable adults, a whole raft of different things. But latterly, and it's relevant for this particular podcast, latterly I was Chief Inspector at the recruitment, and I had to implement GDPR in 2017. And like a lot of organisations, I suppose, when you're asked to do that and you have no knowledge of GDPR or how to implement it or how to demonstrate compliance, I had to do that right across the entire recruitment function for the whole of Police Scotland. So it was a learning curve for me, but it also gravitated me towards doing that when I retired in 2018. So it was nicely timed. And with that experience, I then became a data protection officer and do that still currently to today. So that's from 2018, where I'm outsourced into different organisations of different sizes and help them do their GDPR compliance journeys. And that's me.
That's it. But there's a lot more to that than just being a compliance officer and a data protection officer, because we know you're heavily involved in data protection training and cybersecurity training, which we'll cover in another podcast. What I really want to touch on just now, and what's relevant for this podcast, is regulation, compliance, and that whole piece. But funny enough, some of the podcasts that we've done over the last few weeks, what keeps coming up is this gold standard recognition that GDPR seems to have globally. Why do you suppose that is? Tell us what your views are on why people think GDPR is the gold standard in data protection.
Yes, it's definitely considered the gold standard, Thomas. It's, having just finished a 6-month project with one of the UK oil refineries, that's exactly the message that I was getting across, because they work globally with suppliers and vendors, etc. And it is definitely viewed as the gold standard, and it's probably because it's the first major regulation that's taken what I would describe as a rights-based approach to data protection. So when it first came into effect in 2018, it marked this huge shift from treating personal data as a business asset to then recognising that that's actually an extension of that person, because it's their data. And I quite often say when I'm working with organisations that GDPR makes you consider the person at the centre of what you're doing with their data. And that's a really important point to hang on to. And then previous data privacy laws, well, they focused a lot more on what your organisation's responsibilities were. But the essence of GDPR, and this is what makes it the gold standard, is how it then centres the individual. So it gives them control over how their data is used, how it's stored, how it's shared. And that's only right, isn't it? If it was your data, you would want to have that control, or at least knowledge about what the data was being used for, where it was being stored, and who you're actually sharing it with out with that organisation. So I think what makes it stand out globally, in addition to the centred part of GDPR about an individual, is that this GDPR, so UK and EU GDPR, has got real teeth. And that's what makes it more effective. So, for example, if you look at Meta, it was fined €1.2 billion back in 2023, and that was for breaching cross-border data transfer rules under GDPR. So that just demonstrates and gives you some evidence that this regulation isn't just symbolic, it's got real power behind it. And that's the type of privacy law which other countries should really be aspiring to have. And a lot of them are making real inroads into doing just that.
It's interesting, actually. I knew you'd bring it to life. I knew you'd get all passionate about GDPR and data protection, calling me Thomas. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but that's a whole different thing.
That's your Sunday name.
That's it, yeah. What role does GDPR play in shaping the global privacy regulations? I mean, what role do you think it has out there?
I think essentially it's like the blueprint, because it's working to make data privacy better, not just in the EU and the UK, where it's obviously enforceable, but countries like, if you look at Brazil with the LGPD, if you look at South Korea, and even some of the regions within America, like Colorado and Virginia, they've started to follow GDPR's lead, basically. So if you look at other countries that are now taking on board the same aspects of GDPR, that's because they see that this is the shape and the way that they should be shaping their own data privacy laws. So I always think of it like this. If you think about our digital landscape and how it's changed over the last decade, so just look 10 years ago, and then you look at AI and you look at the technology, and then you compare that to where we are when we had the last UK Data Protection Act, and that was in 1998. So just thinking about the changes in the digital landscape and technology since then, it makes sense that those laws were fragmented, they were outdated, and they were also quite industry specific. What GDPR has done, it's now created this unified model that even governments can localise but still align to GDPR. So that makes, I suppose, more countries adopt this kind of international standard. As I say, if you think about the technology and think about the digital landscape, you need to make sure that the laws are keeping up to date with those changes in that. And that's what GDPR is doing. And I think GDPR fits nicely into that journey of technology.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because I had just a previous podcast with a very successful vendor in the UAE that talked about how important compliance and regulation was in establishing a good foundation for how they approach businesses and companies and clients. Well, why is it then that GDPR's emphasis is so heavily focused on consent and on transparency? Why is it so significant that that's the areas they focus on within GDPR?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an important question actually, because the consent aspect and in particular the transparency aspect is something that, you know, when you're trying to look at GDPR compliance, that's just two of the aspects that you should be focusing on. But in particular, previously companies or organisations were getting buried in the consent aspect in terms of they were burying the consent request in amongst all this different text and legal jargon. And actually you as a user, as an individual, you had no real idea what you were agreeing to or consenting to. And I'm sure you can relate to that yourself, Tommy, when you're thinking about when you're going on to websites and you're actually reading things. If you're asking for your consent, sometimes you get screeds and screeds of pages, and I describe that as a gobbledygoo. So it doesn't make sense to anybody. So what happens is people switch off and they just click agree without actually knowing what they're agreeing to, and that's not really giving consent. So what GDPR changed for consent was that it now has to be really clear, has to be informed, and it has to be an affirmative action taken by the individual. So you can't have these pre-ticked boxes anymore or all of this legal jargon. It's got to be nice, clear and simple and really easy to understand. So you as an individual and I as an individual are actually consenting to what they know they're consenting to. And what consent has done, not just consent, but what GDPR has done is also introduced, and this is the transparency aspect, that all of your company's data practices now need to be much more transparent. So it's made every organisation who's complying with GDPR much more accountable. So being transparent also helps with the accountability principle. So a good example is that, as we spoke about websites a second ago, but if you look at the shift now for your cookie banners across your websites, annoying as they may be to some people, but they're now much clearer and they're more user controlled because GDPR requires that, or PECR actually, but it's all linked into GDPR. And it's part of a broader cultural shift towards digital ethics, I would describe it as. So Tommy, I know when you go onto websites and the cookie banner comes up, I'm absolutely sure you'll not just click accept all. Am I correct?
Correct. It's been drilled into me by somebody not too far away.
You're in control. You should be
Yeah.
in control. And that's what GDPR is actually helping make organisations give back that control to the user.
It's interesting that you should say that, actually, because it moves me really, really well into my next question. How has GDPR changed the way organisations approach data governance? I mean, what has made a difference by the implementation of GDPR when it comes to data governance for companies?
Yeah, so, well, I certainly believe that one of the most significant shifts is that data privacy is now recognised as a business risk. So it's not just viewed as an IT issue. And I think for many, many years, and even when GDPR first came into play, when I went into organisation, you could hear the different departments saying, but that's not our issue, that's an IT issue. And it's absolutely not. It's definitely a business risk. So because it's now being viewed as a business risk, that's then shifting the organisation's approach towards data governance. So it forces you, GDPR forces organisations to map their data flows. So where is their data? How's it coming in? Where's the source of it? What's the internal process from getting that data? Who do we share it with? How is it being stored? All the kind of touch points of that data's journey within the organisation and externally out of the organisation. And that, by able to map your data flows, by documenting your processing activities and considering data protection at every stage of a product or a service life cycle, not lifestyle, but life cycle, well, that's what you're supposed to be doing. And that helps your data governance approach, basically, for GDPR. Now, what I have noticed, Tommy, is whilst being a data protection officer, is that you have responsibilities if you're a DPO, basically. So you've got responsibilities under GDPR, and that makes sure that your organisation is demonstrating accountability. However, if it's left with someone within the organisation who's not a data protection officer, but they've had data protection role lobbed into their existing day job, then that makes it very difficult to take that same structured and compliance evidenced approach to data governance, is what I'm trying to say there, because it's very difficult to speak your truth if you've not got that role of a data protection officer. So going to the board, going to the senior execs and actually identifying where the risks are from GDPR. So it actually makes your data governance role probably more difficult. GDPR helps definitely make you accountable, and it's definitely improved, I would say, the data governance. I mean, you think about there's probably some brands out there that are demonstrating it really clearly, like Apple, for instance. So they've leaned very heavily into privacy as being their brand value. And that's great because they're then showcasing how GDPR-inspired principles can then give you that competitive edge. And that's always a good thing to say to your board and your executive, that if your GDPR journey is leading towards your compliance journey, then you're actually going to have a competitive edge over your out there in the marketplace.
And again, really, really relevant, because obviously you made reference to Apple and, an international organization, but predominantly an American organization. Interesting that they would take data governance, to heart in the way that they have for a number of reasons why. What I want to finish off with is your views on how does GDPR differ in comparison to other data protection laws. And let's use the CCPA as an example, comparable data protection standard or regulation. First of all, just give us a brief about the CCPA. What is that standard? And then give us a comparison as to how GDPR differs from CCPA.
Well, so I think if the question's about what differs, how GDPR differs from likes of your CCPA or, even there's other regulations out there similar in different countries. But one major difference is how deeply GDPR integrates data protection into all the business operations. So where CCPA allows users to opt out of data sales, for example, GDPR goes much, much further and requires opting in consent. And that's a significant difference between GDPR and CCPA. What it also, GDPR goes further to, and that CCPA doesn't do, is about privacy by default. So privacy by default, by design, basically. So even when you're looking at new projects, you've got to look at developing privacy inbuilt at the start rather than trying to introduce something and then frantically thinking, oh, we didn't think about GDPR compliance. So it differs from the privacy by default aspect, the opting in aspect for consents, the data protection impact assessments that are required before you launch any high risk project. So these aren't get out clauses, these are must do elements of GDPR, which is a significant difference between CCPA and California. But I suppose what GDPR doesn't, it's easy to remember this for me, but for everybody else, GDPR doesn't just apply within the EU for EU GDPR and UK for UK GDPR. If you're a company, for example, in Singapore, and you're processing either EU or UK citizens' data, then you've still got to comply with GDPR. So I think I like this aspect of it, so that you've got this extraterritorial scope, which is quite unique from other regulations like the ones that you've mentioned there. So it's pushing companies worldwide to adopt this GDPR level of standard, even if it's not legally required to do that. And that's got to be a good thing.
Whoever said that data protection was boring? Honestly, and you said that the entire time with a big smile on your face. Now, it's interesting that you said, as a global impact and as a significant reach globally, because I believe very shortly you're heading off to Dubai to attend the GISEC conference once again this year.
I am, on the 6th of May.
Great, and you're going to be, OSP Cyber Academy are going to be based at the UK Pavilion in Hall 5. So if anybody has got any questions about data protection, about GDPR, any of the other compliance standards that you need to ask, they can come and find you out at Hall 5 at the UK Pavilion. Would that be right?
Yes, please do. Please come and speak to me anyway. But yeah, I love to chat about data protection and GDPR. You know me well, so I'll be delighted to speak to anybody and to help everybody.
Yeah.
I just love that approach where organisations and individuals within organisations want to do things better. So yeah, please seek me out at GISEC.
Irene, I hate to cut it short, but all that remains for me to say is Irene Coyle, Chief Operating Officer, no longer Chief Inspector at OSP Cyber Academy. Thank you so much for joining Let's Talk Cyber.
Thanks, Tommy.